Global Governance Futures is brought to you from the Global Governance Institute at University College London. This is a podcast about the challenges facing humanity and possible global responses. How does the world hang together? What has gone wrong? And what has global governance got to do with it? To learn more, please visit ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.
What happens when economics forgets the world it was meant to explain? In this episode, I'm joined by Nat Dyer, whose brilliant new book, Ricardo's Dream, offers a compelling journey through the history and hubris of economic thought. We explore how elegant theories came to eclipse the complexity of real-world experience, how the discipline drifted away from power, politics and people, and why that matters now more than ever. It's also a conversation about the late Susan Strange, the pioneering international political economist, who challenged the discipline's core assumptions and refused to separate economics from its political foundations. Nat brings deep insight and sharp clarity to our discussion, but above all, in the spirit of Strange, he reminds us that reclaiming economics isn't just an academic project, it's a political one.
Economists and other modelers recognize the gap between the model and reality, but sometimes the model is then held up as the ideal. This idea that if there's a gap between the model and reality, we need to drag reality closer to the model. And I would say that is a grave problem if we haven't thought deeply about the values that have created the model.
This is Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. Nat Dyer is a writer, researcher and author of Ricardo's Dream, How Economists Forgot the Real World and Led Us Astray, published by Bristol University Press. His work explores the politics of economic thought, the role of values in public policy, and the legacy of critical voices like Susan Strange. We spoke to him in May 2025. Well, Nat, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
We're here to discuss your fantastic book titled Ricardo's Dream, How Economists Forgot the Real World and Led Us Astray, which was published late last year by Bristol University Press. And we also have a shared interest in the work and legacy of famed IR political economy scholar Susan Strange.
Definitely.
Who has featured in various conversations on the podcast. So I'm super excited to have you here. Looking forward to getting into it. And perhaps we shall begin with the book then, and specifically the book title. So why did you write this book now? And what is the story behind the title?
Yeah. In some ways, I think we'll get on to Susan Strange later on in the conversation, but in some ways, she kept on popping up at different chapters, and she was a great critic of abstract reductionist models and always trying to see things in a holistic sense, and was writing at the high point of those models in the sort of 80s and 90s. Obviously her career was longer, but that's where a lot of her output was. And you could see it in some ways of me trying to continue the type of analysis that Strange had and projecting that onto economics. I guess so my background is not in. I'm not an academic. My background is working for various NGOs and research organizations, and at various roles with places like Rainforest Foundation and Global Witness, I came across problems related to rainforest destruction or grand corruption and offshore finance that I realized had an ideational origin as well. It wasn't just about the specific cases we were working on, but there were stories and narratives that decision makers had bought into, which meant that our work was more tricky. So in some ways, part of the book is about following some of those ideas upstream and seeing where they came from and diagnosing the problems. So after Global Witness, I also worked for a small organization called Promoting Economic Pluralism that tries to advocate for more diverse types of economics education within universities. And Yeah, I think it's based on the idea, I'm sure you'll recognize this from a political science point of view, that there is, we talk about economists sometimes having physics envy, but sometimes political scientists or sociologists can have, economics envy, and there can be a certain higher status and credibility given to rational choice models or given to certain types of sort of quantified analysis. And yeah, and so sorry, I'm going on a little bit, but some people have referred to the last few decades as the economists' hour, as in a time where economists had almost unprecedented influence, certainly in the US, but I think also in some ways in the UK as well and elsewhere, in governing policy. And so, yeah, as you say, the subtitle, How Economists Forgot the Real World and Led Us Astray, the central argument is that a lot of those ideas and policies advocated by mainstream economists were based not on a realistic observation of the world, but actually based on what I refer to sort of as a theoretical fantasy world. And so, I'm not the first to say this, I won't be the last, but I wanted to try and tell a compelling story that looked at sort of, the longer history, the 200 years evolution of economics, and to show what I describe as the birth, the death, and the rebirth of this idea of basing policy off on highly abstract theories and why that has been a problem.
Great. And we're going to get into it. So, I mean, one of the themes which has animated a lot of conversations on this podcast is what I'd describe as historicizing the 1990s and placing it within this much longer arc of the dynamics that that sort of led to that quite unusual period, actually. And, I think your book is really a testament to the value of sort of historicizing these domains, which can often be framed as very technical, quite ahistorical sometimes, actually. Sort of the relentless presentism that we find sometimes in politics and economics. And, these themes of systems thinking, complexity thinking, the big picture, these are challenging themes to discipline. And again, that's another theme which comes up a lot in the podcast conversations. But it's also vital, right, that we grapple with the deeper waters, that context. And Susan Strange definitely sort of ran against the grain of the neoliberal triumphalism of the 1990s. And indeed, you write in the book that that this project did grow out of Susan Strange's capacious view of the world, which is a really nice way of putting it. And you also you have some fun along the way, right? I mean, there are a few people here who get a bit skewered. I mean, Paul Krugman, writing in 1995, and the quote is, "The forces that determine the destiny of empires and the fate of kings can sometimes be explained, predicted, or even controlled by a few symbols on a printed page." And I thought that was a wonderful quote. So I suppose where we might go next, what is it that economists are really missing about the real world? And in the book, you actually write that to help guide us through this century, the world needs good political and economic thinkers who can confidently answer yes to the question at the heart of this book: got reality? So perhaps you could expand on that.
Yeah, that was also me being a little cheeky, playing off the, got milk kind of idea. But yeah, got reality. Yeah, no, I know there's lots in that. And the Krugman quote, yeah, comes from the mid-90s when he's, really pushing this idea that all of these critics of globalization, they don't understand the power of models. They don't understand the power of David Ricardo's model. So the book's obviously called Ricardo's Dream. So a lot of it goes back to the classical economist David Ricardo, who I refer to as the other founding father of economics alongside Adam Smith, with a very different approach to Adam Smith, a stockbroker turned economist turned politician. And sort of, yeah, Krugman was really pushing that idea. He published an influential article called Ricardo's Difficult Idea, where basically the argument was, if only people read Ricardo, if only they understood this stuff, all of this opposition would melt away. And at times he compared people who didn't believe in free trade to evolution deniers and creationists. This was science, and then you had anti-science. And yeah, there's a number of different ways we can go with this, but your central question is, what are economists missing? And I think Strange can help here as well. And one of if I were asked to choose my favorite pages of Susan Strange's work at any time, got it on my desk actually. It's the beginning of States and Markets, which is her sort of classic book, and she starts with these desert island stories. And the desert island stories start with this sort of idea of a boat sunk in the middle of the ocean, and then three different lifeboats end up on three different areas of a desert island. Neither of them know that the others are there, and they all order themselves in a different way. So the ship's captain takes over and he builds stockades and he's sort of in control, and that's a society controlled and motivated by the value of order and security. You have another one with a sort of idealistic group of students, and they share the tasks all together, and that's one motivated by, justice or fairness. And then you have a third one, and it's the ship's purser, and he gets this bag of nails, and he says, right, these nails are going to be our currency. So, we'll pay this person to look after the children. This person can trade with this. And so that's a society created on the basis of the value of efficiency or wealth. And then she says to her students, okay, what happens if these societies meet? First, what do you think would happen? And then later, what would you like to happen? And essentially, I think it's such a wonderful big picture view. And the reason I raise it is because essentially economists have largely looked at the world only through the value of wealth or efficiency. That's not true for all economists. And what I want to do in the book is to argue that there's been much discussion within economics about this, but we're coming out of a period where one school of thought has really dominated. And yes, so essentially just seeing the value of efficiency or wealth and having everything else having to be translated into that or being valueless has caused I steal a line from Daniel Kahneman, theory-induced blindness. So it's a theory that makes you blind. And you can see that most clearly in discussions in the US now about, for example, semiconductors and China. The value of security has reasserted itself. Obviously, that value can go to an extreme, and that value can be destructive. And yeah, people on the, working on human rights or, the climate movement are advocating for greater attention to justice. So essentially, I argue that these other values don't really have purchase in economics. And the way that it describes itself as this objective, value-free, almost like a social physics, economics tends to, crush the space and thinking and I guess legitimacy of discourse around these other values. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah, thanks, Nat. Yeah, the desert island analogy is wonderful. It reminds me a bit of Aldous Huxley's final book, Ireland, where he transports us to the Pacific island and constructs a kind of utopian ideal society. So yeah, very interesting.
I need to read that. I like Brave New World very much, but Ireland's been on my long list for a while. But yeah, it might have just been bumped up now. I should read it.
It's a great book. Yeah. Perhaps we should also just, and I don't know whether I'll just raise this, but we may want to qualify that we're not necessarily talking about all economics. I think at some point you say that, applied microeconomics may be somewhat immune or somewhat insulated from these critiques. I don't know if you want to just elaborate a little bit on that.
No, that's a good point. I guess there's a couple of points there. One is that, the economics profession is obviously diverse and broad, and there's many people working away in many different areas that are not directly connected to the kind of macroeconomics that I look at in the book. the other thing to say is that there's obviously been positive changes within the economics profession in the last few decades. I think you can see the high watermark of the type of economics that I write about being the 1980s, the 90s, and I think into the 2000s. I think it did last there, but I would also argue that it has not been completely overthrown, and there is an attempt to remake economics while also preserving a lot of what I would see as the sort of bad fantasy theory from the high point. But yeah, and as I said, the book, although it is a critique of economics, it draws on a lot of discussions within the field itself. So I cite Nobel Prize winners such as Angus Deaton or Paul Romer, who have been more critical of some of the sort of drift of economics. I cite Banerjee and Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, and then also look at some of the sort of more classic figures from the history of economics, such as Adam Smith and John Maynard Keynes, who I believe had that much larger vision, but they've often been translated and interpreted by more recent thinkers, especially in textbooks, as a much more sort of narrow shadow version of themselves. So no, I'm not trying to say every single economist is like this, but I am arguing that there is a very persistent and worrying strain of that I another little play on words I have in the book is that the classic book about the history of economics is called The Worldly Philosophers by Heilbronner, and then The Economist actually came out after the financial crisis and called them the other worldly philosophers, because it's this idea of looking through the complexity of the world in order to try and find these simplified models, and how that led us astray during the financial crisis. And I would argue, some people say, that's a once in a century event. That's just in the area of finance. I would like to argue that it's much broader than that.
Right, and I think that's definitely something which comes through, and within the context of international relations or global governance, the political normativity of what is actually occurring here. The degree to which these ideas are instrumentalized, crystallized, and create a certain set of assumptions that are taken for granted and become the water that we swim in. So, Robert Cox famously standing alongside Susan Strange in terms of being a major iconoclast in the field through the 80s, through the 70s, present day. I think you've already touched on this, but I was struck by this passage. The main cost I want to convince you is that the questions seeming being studied are quietly replaced with different, easier, less relevant ones. This problem-solving strategy is called substitution. The most profound substitution in economics has been conceptually replacing human welfare with the universal measuring rod of money. So perhaps if I were to then shift focus into another context, which you engage in the book, which is definitely big picture and definitely very much of interest to our audience. What do you see as the central danger posed by mainstream economic thinking when it comes to existential crises, specifically the climate crisis?
Yeah, no, thanks for pulling up that substitution point. And yeah, that's a sort of central theme of various people have different words for it, but essentially it's coming up with a seemingly very scientific, quantified answer to a question. But only if you sort of dig into the assumptions do you realize that that very neat, wonderfully precise answer has been bought at the price of changing the actual question. And yeah, and so some people will call it illusionary precision. I think Mervyn King and John Kay a few years ago called it bogus quantification. Yeah, there's a various. I have sort of slightly more rude words that I call it sometimes, but yeah, essentially related to the climate. Yeah, so I have a chapter later on in the book, as I say, that the book sort of takes you through a 300 year history, and then towards the end, I have a number of chapters that try to illustrate some of the problems of this narrow otherworldly approach. And so a one on finance, one on trade, and one on climate. And I reference particularly the work of William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on climate economics in 2018. And what was controversial during his Nobel speech was that he produced a very nice looking graph trying to plot the optimum warming temperature, and it rose to about 3 degrees by the end of the century and 4 degrees in about 150 years' time. And this is obviously more than double the Paris targets of 2-1.5 degrees that were agreed in 2015. Now, not saying those targets are obviously extremely ambitious, but what Nordhaus argues is that it's essentially impossible, and we shouldn't even attempt to get there. And I put that in the context of sort of, Nord has been writing about these things full on since the 90s, and has quite a long history, I argue, of underplaying the economic risks of climate change. And we can break that. I can say more about that. We can break that down a little bit more of the specifics of that.
I mean, one thing which struck me was just how influential Nordhaus has been. Why do you think his models, despite the flaws that you point out in the chapter, became so influential with policymakers?
I think part of it is that he was the main game in town. So he worked on this space earlier than other people. Um, I think he also comes with a great deal of credentials. He was the co author in the later years of a very famous book, textbook in economics, called Economics, by Paul Samuelson, who was essentially one of the founders of post-war American economics, modern neoclassical economics. And obviously, he is at Yale. He has, many credentials, and I think the message that Nordhaus gives to the political and industrial establishment was a comforting one. Was actually that these are rather small problems. In the 90s, ahead of the Earth Summit, he produced a figure. I think it was 0.5% of GDP that might be at risk in a 50 to 75 year period. I'd need to look back at the exactly to remember the figure. But essentially, I think part of the reason why they have been influential is because of that. I also think there's a phenomenon of, we live in an age of specialists, which in some areas is wonderful, but we have each specialism has its own domain, and it's quite difficult if you are not trained to a certain level to engage with different specialisms. And so I think that has helped to insulate his work from criticism. I should probably add, just for the avoidance of doubt, Nordhaus is very concerned about climate change. He is in no way a climate change denier. He is a strong advocate and supporter of increasing the cost of carbon in order to deal with crisis. My argument with him, and not just my argument, but as I say in the book, many other people, including Martin Weissman, who was at Harvard, is that the estimates that he has made of the economic impact of climate change have vastly underestimated the risks, and in that way has led people astray.
Right. I mean, some people might look at that and take a kind of cynical view that actually this is kind of a knowing, if you will, misuse of economics. And you do address that, right? The degree to which perhaps economists are complicit in structural injustice. And there is that potential for the knowing misuse of these models. But as you point out, actually, what you observe at least is something that's more interesting than that there's kind of a mutually reinforcing mix of the naive and knowing misuse of models. And indeed, I don't think you do imply that Nordhaus is being cynical, that ultimately this is a situation of good faith disagreements, which
Mm.
perhaps is more surprising than the cynical position.
Yeah, no, you've highlighted an important point. And this was something that came out as I went through various, rounds of editing the book. And yeah, that formulation of the knowing and the naive and how each can um reinforce each other was helpful. So yeah, part of the climate chapter, building on the work of Benjamin Franter, who is at Oxford, I look at some of the more knowing misuse of climate models, especially the work of the consultancy Charles River Associates, which was often paid for by American business lobby groups. And even now, some of the modelers who created those models have gone on record saying we could only tell half the story. And it's the classic problem of a model. I say at some points is a bit like the spotlight in a theater. And so when it's pointed at the main action at the center of the stage, it can really help sharpen your focus. But if it's pointed to a side character, or if it excludes certain things, everything that's outside the bright uh, shaft of the spotlight tends to get thrown into even greater darkness. And modelers have a massive decision to make about what to include or not include into the model. Sometimes that's a decision based on what is easily quantified or unquantified. Often things like politics and war are just left out of models because they're inherently difficult to quantify. But sometimes there is a more knowing misuse, so that certain assumptions, for example, about the price or availability of alternative energy sources. One of the models I look at assumed that green energy was 6 times more expensive than fossil fuel energy, which at a certain point could have been true, but certainly with the plummeting cost of solar and other energy now, is not always the case. So if you have that built into the very baseline, the results that you spit out are going to be difficult, are going to be different. And I refer to that at some point of well, various ways, but in some ways this is theoretical cherry picking. So it's sort of cherry picking your assumptions in order to get the results that you like. And I make the analogy too with there's a famous, I don't know if you know it, MC Escher drawing of a staircase that goes round and round and round. And it looks like every step of the staircase is leading somewhere, but you realize at the end that it takes you right back to the beginning. And there's quite a few examples too where you can see that it is, the real decisions have been made in the assumptions and the setting up of the quantified model, and the output of it is completely constrained by that. And that's something that many people, even John Maynard Keynes, over 100 years ago said, if you want to critique these things, don't look at the logical superstructure which has been created with great care and great precision. And that's where some of the naivety comes from, because it's almost a feeling of, oh, this is so beautiful and it fits together so well. Don't necessarily look at the logical superstructure, dig down and look at the assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, what really comes through, I think, is just the power of these ideas, how enchanting they can be. And the whole book hinges on the work of an economist from the late 18th century, right, David Ricardo. But in this context of the climate crisis, you quote Steve Keen, who is a heterodox economist affiliated with UCL, actually, who suggests that Nordhaus's work could be exposed soon as the most significant and dangerous wrong turn in the history of science.
Certainly.
Which is quite a claim.
Yeah, no, and Steve's work certainly helped me, orientate myself to Nordhaus, and he should be, and he helped sort of pierce the veil in some ways and look behind. Essentially, Nordhaus has used two different sorts of ways to come up with his numbers. He first started off using a very simplified, simplistic sectoral model, and then he moved on to a more statistical model, which looks at average temperatures and also average GDP, and tries to see and looks at the correlation between them, but then uses that to try and project forward to say, if these relationships hold, what will a warming planet give us in terms of GDP? But as Steve Keen writes, and I quote him and others, there are many problems with both of those methods.
Right. Yeah. I think I remember some analogy. Yes, it will be great, and we'll all be on the London Underground in 60-degree temperatures, enjoying being boiled to death.
Yeah.
But before we move on to Susan Strange, I do want to just flag this line in the chapter. How large and essential can something be and still be considered external? So I wanted to ask, did the concept of an externality, which is all over climate economics, but also within quite a lot of rational choice political scholarship as well in that field, did the idea of externalities ever really make sense?
Ooh, good question. I'm sure it makes sense in some limited areas. This is probably one of the more radical parts of the book, in that I argue that the whole idea of an externality has been better at saving the theory than it has done at saving the planet. And what I mean by that is that if you are going to at least acknowledge the natural world, the living world, the idea of an externality is the most minimal way you can do so, whilst trying to preserve the theory. The reason why that's more controversial is that the world in which I came from, the sort of, NGO world, not completely, but in large part, has bought into this idea of externality as a way of seeing things that were neglected by market mechanisms. And it is supported by the economic story of the price system as this almost magical way of the market finding out the cheapest and best ways of doing things, that is far beyond sort of any planners, or far beyond any other better than any other method. But yes, I argue, essentially that it is ridiculous to think of the entire natural world as being external and the real picture and the real deal being the human economy. Even if you look from just a historical point of view, the natural world has been around for billions of years, and human civilization is extremely recent addition and subset of that. So yeah, I think we would have much more interesting conversations if we could recognize some of the real weaknesses of the externality narrative.
So I do want to shift focus and discuss Susan Strange's work with you.
Yeah, yeah.
And in some ways, what we've discussed up to now, it's very resonant with many of the concerns that Susan Strange held. And you've done really important work recovering, making visible the legacy of Susan Strange. Indeed, you organised a conference last year at King's College London titled Strange Times, I believe.
Yes, yes, yes. Strange times, and it was jointly held between King's and LSE.
Great,
Just for the
yeah.
record, yeah.
So, what do you think Susan Strange offers us today, then, especially, you know, in an era where perhaps the economic orthodoxy is under increasing strain, increasing contestation, and also an era of the poly crisis
Mm.
and this, the currency of systemic crisis now in mainstream debate around where we find ourselves.
Yeah, what does Strange offer us? I mean, I've said earlier about her broad holistic vision. I mean, I came across Strange in about 2006 when I was studying for a master's in international politics, international political economy up in Edinburgh University. And she was sort of midway down a sort of, additional reading list. She certainly wasn't up on the top of anything. But as soon as I started reading her, I thought, oh, she writes extremely clearly and she's got great points. And so I ended up writing my dissertation partly about her and the Asian financial crisis of 1997. And then, sort of just, less than a year after I finished that master's, we had the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And I sort of naively thought, oh, Strange, she wrote a book called Casino Capitalism in the 80s. She then followed up a book called Mad Money right before she died. She's basically seen all of this coming. She's going to be, her star is going to rise. And new stars did rise, and you had people like Hyman Minsky and people like that. But essentially, a few people did, but very few people recognized Strange's contribution. Um, Although I should give a shout out to Randall Germain in particular at Carleton University, who was, along with Blaine Haggett, one of the co-organizers of the Strange Times conference, and he has sort of kept Strange's light burning and sort of organized various roundtables and edited books on her that people should check out. But essentially, what I see in Strange is that often she has got to something before other people. So there were numerous times in the book. So obviously with finance, and we can break down her idea of casino capitalism if you want, but also related to international trade. She was well aware of some of the weaknesses and some of the historical inaccuracies of the classic stories of trade, which are taught. She was also pioneered a concept called triangular diplomacy, which argued that we were talking earlier about the 1990s being this, special period. And I think in some ways it was, and there might be a bit of a throwaway line, but there's an idea of, at the end of the Cold War, we knew that the East would have a revolution, but we were less prepared for the West also to have a revolution. And I think we did in many ways in the 90s. And in that decade, Strange wrote about how international, global governance, and this is more your area than mine, but how it was no longer the old story of state to state diplomacy, but also you had state to corporation diplomacy, but then corporation to corporation diplomacy. So it was now a triangle. And in my work with NGOs, whether that's looking at, palm oil, or whether that's looking at corruption and transparency about payments that oil companies are making to governments, so much of that is done in this sort of triangular diplomacy. You might want to add NGOs in there. Sometimes they're more influential than others. So I think Strange offers us many different fruitful avenues for thinking about future crises, even though she's been dead for, coming on 30 years.
Yeah, I find quite a lot of master students right now are actually rediscovering Susan Strange's structural power
Oh, yeah, that's
framework
great. Yeah.
to look at the issues around digital sovereignty, issues around artificial intelligence and militarization of dual use technology. And I'm supervising these projects, and it's great fun. As
Yeah,
you,
that's great. And yeah, you're right. I completely didn't even mention structural power, which is probably her most influential point of view. And yeah, and the conference was very good for that because we did have people taking, Strange's framework and talking about big tech and talking about data and also talking about structural power related to the rise of China. And, Strange argued, and I think this has been sort of brushed over a little bit, but, the ideas of hard and soft power often get repeated, certainly within sort of lay discussions of global governance. But actually, I think her idea of structural power is very interesting. And yeah, and I think it's particularly related to to financial power as well. And you can see that in I think the US has woken up in recent years to its role in financial power.
yeah, and as you also write about in a blog post, actually, on a posthumous essay by Susan Strange titled "I Never Meant to Be an Academic," Strange was very happy to be a contrarian. And, in international relations, she famously slayed various sacred cows and indeed dragons. That was a
Mm,
devastating critique in 1982 of neoliberal institutional theory, just as it
mm.
was really getting going. Um, you've used the myth of Pygmalion to describe how economists can fall in love with their own models. And I think Strange also was kind of in the business of sort of destroying illusion, if you will. Perhaps you could just unpack a little bit how how this metaphor, how this myth helps us understand the dangers of forgetting that these models are only simplified pictures of the world.
Yeah, no, exactly. Thank you. So I actually came to the resonance of the Pygmalion myth through reading George Box, who is a British statistician and is probably most well known for his quote saying that all models are wrong and some are useful, but all models are wrong, but some are useful. And this is often employed by people on the other side of the argument to say, criticizing a model for being simple is misunderstanding what a model is. A model is essentially a map. And if I were to tell you how to get to my house and I gave you a map and I included on that map every single, species of wildflower that you were going to cross along the way, that would be really an unhelpful map to help you navigate to my house. So depending on the task at hand, what a model does at its best is to isolate the essential things you need to know and exclude the rest. But the big question is what gets included in that spotlight beam, what gets called essential and what doesn't. And Box, which surprised me because his quote is so often used to defend modeling, was actually no outright supporter of this is the only way to go. And he argued that thinkers needed to be ambidextrous and, yes, use models, but also be very aware of what's happening in the real world and also always toggle between the two. And so he said that the he's talking about statisticians, but for this point, we can talk about economists or anyone really who uses models, should not be like Pygmalion and fall in love with their model. I didn't know too much about the story, but it has inspired Hollywood classics like My Fair Lady, and then more recently the AI fantasy Her. And the original story is of this ancient Cypriot sculptor. He was a wonderful sculptor, and he also decided he hated all of the women around him. And none of them were good enough for him. So he went back and he sculpted his own perfect woman, but then essentially was entranced by his own art and fell in love with her and bought her jewels and clothing and laid her down in bed and creepy things like that. And the moral of the story that Box uh, uses is essentially that people who create models um, should not be so enamored with the beauty and perfection and symmetry and wonder of their own creation, that they don't attend to the real world. There is a bit of a twist in the tale, because in the original tale, Pygmalion prays to goddess, I believe it's Athena, for a woman like his Pygmalion statue to appear, and he comes back, and the statue has come to life. And I think this also speaks to the idea sometimes that economists and other modelers recognize the gap between the model and reality, but sometimes the model is then held up as the ideal. And I think you can see this when people write about, well, if only as humans were as rational as, textbook economic man or Homo economicus, then the world would be a better place. I'm thinking particularly about a quote from Alan Greenspan on that. And that is very much this idea that if there's a gap between the model and reality, we need to drag reality closer to the model. And I would say that is a grave problem if we haven't thought deeply about the values that have created the model.
Yeah, so it's really cool how you weave in sort of the contemporary references. So the ways myth informs Hollywood. So Her is a great film. It also made me think of Lars and the Real Girl with Ryan Gosling. I think that also perhaps maybe informed by the myth as well.
I'll need to check that out.
And yes, that actually is a great segue to something I also wanted to discuss. I mean, it also reminds me of Alfred Korzybski's famous remark that the map is not the territory, and that, actually this sort of model produces a very anemic view of life, and it's not really a model that humans actually live by in the cut and thrust, the richness of their day-to-day interactions with family and so on. But I wanted to push a little bit on what might be the dangers here. So, we've discussed a bit why this disconnect between elegance in theory and failure in practice occurs. But there's a quote here in your book from Max Weber. And you write, efforts to close the gap between the ideal and the real sometimes involve, as Weber saw, quote, violence to reality in order to prove the real validity of the construct. And you go on to write that this violence might only intensify in our age of surveillance, artificial intelligence, and synthetic biology. So there seems like a very important caution here as to where we go as we sort of step forward into the mid 21st century. Perhaps you could expand a bit on that.
Yeah, that's right at the end of the book, and I would say is an area of sort of emerging thinking rather than something I've sort of fully thought through so far. But yeah, it's exactly related to what I was saying just earlier about this gap between the two and the efforts to pull humans in. In writing the conclusion, I realized, and I think I show in the book, various examples of well, in some ways, I know this podcast is subtitled "Imperfect Utopias," and it's this idea of a utopia, whether that's a free trade utopia, or a utopia of a whole world of rational price maximizers, and how that can be a problem. But then I sort of was questioning myself, does that mean I'm against all attempts to try to improve the human condition? Are we just doomed to never progress? Was I against any sort of essentialism or idealism? And I don't believe that's the case. But the difference for me is having a much more rounded and holistic view of the values that go into that vision. And for me, it's got to be values based on the human I think I would broadly say I'm in the humanist camp. And my argument against this violence to reality is that it is often only based often the values are implicit or not properly discussed, and then then the values that are not included are often just ignored, or sometimes the theorists will say we'll come back to those later, or actually sometimes they're outright denied. But yeah, in terms of specific threats, you mentioned their synthetic biology, mass surveillance. I mean, I don't, yeah, it doesn't need to be a great prophetic seer to see that with things like Neuralink, we're moving to a stage where the idea of cyborgs is no longer something from science fiction. And so I think that the vision that we have of what a human is very important. I would also say it's not beyond the realms of possibility that we could evolve to a situation in which elites literally change their biological or genetic makeup in order to essentially become a different species. And that would be an extremely troubling, obviously, development for anyone who has um, democratic leanings or anyone who believes in the welfare of the great body of the people, as Adam Smith once put it.
So I think we're drawing to a close, Nat. And we've sort of broached the conclusion,
Mm,
and again, I think it's admirable that you're that you're engaging these very challenging frontiers. And in many ways, I suppose this is the mark of a productive, fertile project, is that you often are left with as many questions as answers. And yes, you convey a critique here, but the book itself is not defeatist, right? I think you write at some point that we may be witnessing the second fall of economic thinking founded on unreality. If so, it's about time. Um, Perhaps we could close with a question around, well, what do you see as the most promising sources of that change today? As Robert Cox would say, the future is open-ended. It will be informed by the interests and preferences of powerful social forces that are sort of competing to imprint their interests onto the future. So, so what are the ideas that really give you reason to hope?
um, yeah, another great question. I mean, I have a chapter right at the end called New Hope, where I look at some of the sacred cows of neoliberal dash neoclassical economics that have been slayed in particularly in the last 10 years, or seen as um, or been shown to be fairy tales. So I'm thinking of Thomas Piketty's work on inequality, undermining the Kuznets curve that essentially said, whenever the economic developments will ultimately lead to more equality. I'm also thinking of sort of much more empirically based work on the um, minimum wage and living wage than the consensus that reigned up until the 90s. And also, yeah, better work on tax, and obviously, sort of on a more practical note, I think finally there are positive moves looking at trying to get a global minimum corporation tax. Obviously, that is stalled at the moment, and nothing coming out of the White House is helping that. But I use that to make the point that a rejection of this particular type of hyperglobalization that we've had does not necessarily mean a retreat into isolationism. It can mean new forms of global cooperation. Um, and yeah, and I think there is more a general turn to um, away from high theory and towards more empirics in economics, which is positive. Yeah, and when you talk about the the students coming through who are rediscovering Susan Strange and seeing her in relation to digital governance, I think that's really encouraging as well. And then other sources of hope, I guess, go beyond the book. I've been quite struck. There's a really good series. I don't know if you've seen it at all, but it's a very short podcast series by Naomi Alderman on the BBC called The Third Information Crisis. And she makes, I mean, it's again a very big picture point, but she talks about the first information crisis being the creation of writing, the second information crisis being the creation of printing, and the third information crisis being digital work and the internet. And at each, the bad news is that at each stage there has been massive disruption and problems, but also out of the writing, you had the axial age with the birth of new moral traditions and religions. Out of the printing, you ultimately had the Enlightenment, which obviously has its failures, but had many benefits for human society. And so she sort of argues that even though things will get worse for a while, if we hold in there and manage to get through this, there's a potential for some really exciting things to happen. And I do think that underneath, we've obviously gone through, final part of my answer now, we've obviously gone through, there was, in the early decades of the internet, there was this very rose-tinted idea of, wow, this is going to connect everyone. And, oh, look at the Arab Spring and everyone's going to use these technologies for liberation. And now we seem to have flipped completely back the other way. But I do think it is just an incredible resource for people learning about the world, for knowledge to escape from the confines of universities. And I think there's a lot of interesting things bubbling underneath. And I think there's certainly within economics, there's a lot of people who are sort of, in their 40s and younger who are doing some really interesting stuff. And I have hope that they will be the people who can lead us to a better 21st century.
Brilliant. Well, we certainly live in daunting or interesting times, but also exciting times. Strange times, indeed. Yeah. But the book is a very helpful companion, I think, to making sense of, how we got here and where we might be going. And obviously, economics has played such a powerful role within the construction of modern industrial civilization. It's an absolutely vital area to get to grips with. It's a great book. I think it's been a great conversation. So thank you so much for joining us, Nat. Really appreciate it.
I've really enjoyed it, Tom. And yeah, thank you for reading the book so carefully and pulling out bits that you found interesting. And yeah, hope we can speak again sometime.
I look forward to that.
Thanks for tuning in to Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. If you liked this content, please do leave us a comment and subscribe. If you're new to the show and you want to get a list of our favorite books, other resources, listen to past shows, and to join our community, go to ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.